Hi Mikkel.
Hi Brian.
So today we are going to try to tackle a big question. How do you set yourself up for growth when the market isn't growing? And I think that actually is a big question for a lot of companies, particularly in this tech and industrial space where maybe having a market-leading product or whatever has kind of been the source of growth, but then they hit a slump. And not because the product is suddenly bad or because people aren't working hard anymore, but what you're saying is that it's maybe because they haven't designed for growth at the core. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Yes.
And maybe to kind of set the scene, you open with a kind of a paradox in this recent white paper you've written called The Growth System, which is basically, on one hand, growth is maybe the number one priority if you step into a boardroom. On the other hand, it's actually very hard to find companies really delivering consistent growth. So what's happening? Why is there this gap?
And maybe to contextualize to your point, this paper is written written for the sort of tech and industrial companies that have a very sort of hardcore engineering legacy. So I think one thing that happens is that a lot of companies have this dominant R&D and engineering driven spirit and DNA, which permeates in everything, and that typically leads to some variation of if we build it, they will come. And maybe there's also a historical perspective where a lot of these companies sort of the whole raison d'etre for the companies is that they maybe invented a category, or they had a very sort of exceptional technology that has done them well for many years. So that's a typical backdrop. Another backdrop is that maybe they've been playing in an industry that just by sort of laws of growth has been sort of growing, and they have taken a fair share of that growth and then grown with the industry, which has been satisfactory for a lot of these companies. So two things happen. Maybe the products are not as fantastic as they used to be, or you have good enough competitors, so you have true sort of technological and product level competition, and maybe there's a bit of structural headwinds as well, right, in the macro environment. And then when that sort of when that happens, what you're sort of quite clearly can see is that growth has not been designed per se as a commercial system. It's sort of happened by coincidence more than design.
I think you frame it as growth happening as a byproduct of other things, which I think is quite powerful, right? Hey, we're doing all these things, building great products, and we're in the right market, and growth just kind of happens. And it's in a way, of course, it's counterintuitive to, hearing a boardroom talk or a management meeting talk where they talk a lot about growth, but maybe again more as a byproduct, like looking at numbers, talking about numbers.
Yeah, my experience is they talk about growth like, hey, how much can we grow? What's the forecast? What's the stretch goal? But not growth as a design system. So I think that's the sort of wide space we're trying to cover with this paper, to argue that you can actually design a system for growth.
And I think that's compelling, right? And maybe also the uplifting part of this paper is that, hey, we can do something.
Yes.
One of the things you mentioned is that, okay, when companies get to that realization, we're lacking in growth, the market is not with us anymore, you kind of describe these two classic responses. One, simply to do more, right? Like on the activity side. Okay, let's more activities. I need longer activity lists, more to-dos, sales should do more, marketing should do more. And the other thing you describe is kind of let's add more planning, right? Let's think more about which markets, how we're going to do it, etc., etc. In a way, I mean, what's wrong? Like, those two sound pretty good, right? I'm sure more activities are better than fewer activities. More plans are better than fewer plans, or what?
And they are, and I think both are part of the sort of the recipe in many ways, but they're often done in isolation, right? So increased activity without a clear plan, and a lot of the other things we'll cover in a few seconds, typically just leads to more on a broken system. So more sales training, when your go-to-market model is broken, does not really solve anything. More products if we don't know how to earn money on the existing products we have. More markets when we're failing in our home market, and all these things, right? So the more piece just adds more noise if it's done on a sort of a rotten foundation. To the strategy piece, this is more the pitfall of turning it into sort of a desktop exercise, right? Where we all agree and this is the plan, and then people just go back to doing whatever they did yesterday, and it turns into this strategy theater thing, right?
Which is also pure planning, but without execution and follow.
Yeah, and that's maybe we'll cover in a few minutes, but that's the system thinking that we'll get to in a few seconds. So both are needed, but there's some added nuance, and of course these two worlds need to be tied together.
Yeah.
What you do and sort of where you want to play and all these things.
And I think one of your lines here is basically what's the alternative to growth through an integrated system is kind of let's just have a very long list of initiatives. Yeah. And I think I've at least seen that many times, maybe also been guilty of it, that hey, the more initiatives we put on the slide, initiative 1, 2, 3, 4, 13, the better, right? Because the more things we do in the market, the better we get, or what. So I think this kind of distinction between do we just do a lot of things versus do we have an actual system? I think that's really powerful. And I don't know, do you have kind of maybe like a real world example of what does that actually look like in practice to have a system instead of just a long list?
You can. Before we get to what's inside the box, I think you need to think of it like a causal chain of things that needs to be in place, right? One thing is that you must compete in an area where there is a meaningful demand and you have some sort of right to win. And that's some of the stuff a typical strategy will clarify, but we'll get to what that means. Then you need to have customers in those arenas actually willing to choose you over some sort of competing alternatives. And then thirdly, and this is also an extremely important thing, you need to be able to capture some sort of economic value from that transaction. And then fourthly, you should be able to do that at a repeatable and scalable way without the economics breaking down. That's basically the sort of chain of events that needs to happen for you to build a sort of a growth system. What's interesting is it's not really one initiative, it's not really a department, it's a collective of things that runs across the firm that needs to be in place in order for you to set in motion these chain of events, right? So it's part strategic clarity, commercial design, resource allocation, execution discipline, capability building, but all sort of built as one coherent system, rather than sort of we do a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and then things are not really coherently put together. I think that's also extremely important, of course.
Where do you kind of see most often that it's disconnected, right? Because I feel like many companies get to this kind of where to play, how to win type of, let's say, the beginning part of that causal chain you're talking about, where hey, we do kind of know which markets we want to win in, and we kind of know also how to win, at least in parts of that, right? So where does it crack?
Well, I think there is actually a fair amount of companies that are not totally clear on that. So, the half glass, half full version is some probably
we're positive 50, here. We're
60%
positive guys.
of companies kind of have clarity on where they play, and that clarity is shared by everyone in the company
that's
across the commercial chain. But I've also met a fair share of pretty big companies where there's a lot of different truths sort of floating around on these key questions. But granted, if we say that is completely clear, I think it's of course important. I think one thing that is typically also missing is maybe understanding the value pools inside that frame, instead of just saying market A, market B. Do you have clarity on where the value is and how much you realistically can win within that market? I think adding a little bit more substance and depth to those discussions is typically also pretty fruitful, I would say. But granted that we know that, which I'm not sure all companies have in place, but if that is in place, some of the things that break down after that is typically related to some of the more sort of tactical operational design pieces around go-to-market models, sales and marketing motions, engagement models, pricing and packaging. It's not strategy per se, but the key concepts that allow you to run a strong commercial system are not necessarily thought through or super inconsistently applied or have mutated into trial and error or whatever it is, right? So there's not clarity around some of these key design engines that really puts you in a position to capture that potential that you have identified, right?
I think maybe one thing I've noticed sometimes that it is kind of that middle of, hey, I think we can all agree we want to win the SMB market. Oh, okay, let's win the SMB market. And we can all agree that we need to have salespeople who are good at selling. Okay, but it's kind of that middle ground of, but how are we going to set up the go-to-market model? What's the value proposition?
Is there demand in the market, or do we need to create the demand? Do we need to find the customers? How does that turn in? And what is the unit economics in that engine? If you're talking SMB, for example, we see a lot of companies where they set up a field-heavy force, which is more akin to a mid-market type of sales organization, and then they're pursuing SMB clients where the unit economics breaks down. So that disconnect is important, or completely neglecting partners, which could be a super viable route to market, but for some reason we've married to a direct sales model, and that's sort of the all and be all of how we go to market, right? So getting clarity around a lot of these things, and another thing is on the engagement piece. We have net new customers, or we have existing customers. How do we engage those existing customers? Do we see expansion potential? Is churn a major thing? Is there a very sort of uneven distribution of clients where we have a few very big ones that require some sort of treatment versus a long tail of smaller clients that we could maybe even totally sort of digitalize the relationship? Getting a grip on a lot of these middle layer things, I think is one of the biggest sort of choke points of this thing, because you have to be very deliberate in how you design these different things downstream from your strategy, and then consistently.
And you're fighting inertia sometimes, right? If you are going against an existing go-to-market model. And I just want to come back to your point on strategy. I think it's kind of, I take your point that sometimes it's like, we have control of that. Like I have a recent funny example of, we're sitting in a management team, we're totally agreeing, we're going after the enterprise in this segment, it's going to be great. And then, 2 days later, you talk to an actual salesperson who are miles apart, right? And say, no, we're in the SMB. I'm sorry, what? So like very, very basic core decisions like that sometimes take a long time to go from the management meeting to the actual front line, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So let's say we buy that premise. We need to treat growth as a system and not a causal system, and not a kind of long list of initiatives. So if growth is a system, what are kind of the core parts of it, and how do they work together?
If we had to bucket things with some sort of big headlines, the way I see it is there's at least at the highest possible level of abstraction 3 layers that needs to be in place as part of that system. The first one is strategic focus, and it's really down to some very basic key questions, as you alluded to before. Where do we play? Do we make informed decisions about where we play in terms of where the value is in the market, our sort of right to win in those parts of the market, and do we have clarity and coherence within the company across these key choices? So I don't want to turn that into a massive sort of intellectual exercise, but getting to that point of agreement and clarity is actually not sort of a totally mundane exercise. But But that is sort of layer one.
Yeah.
Layer two is what I call commercial architecture. So we alluded to it a bit before as well. Some of these key engines and concepts that make your commercial strategy come alive in many ways when the rubber hits the road. And then finally, I would say the third pillar is execution, capability, and discipline. Do you have the right capabilities? Do you have the right system, practical execution system, and the discipline within that system to stay on course? And if you're deviating from course, it's based on some informed decisions, right? So that's really following through and making sure you have the muscles, the resources invested in line with some of the things that happened upstream from from that piece, right? Yeah. So strategic focus, commercial architecture, execution capability, and discipline, I would say.
But I think it would be cool to open up each of those three. I mean, if we start with strategic focus, which makes sense as a place to start, I think one of the things I picked up in the paper is, on one hand, you have this idea that most companies would probably say that they have strategic priorities, right? Or at least formulated as we want to do X, or we want to be the leader in Y, stuff like that. But again, don't necessarily act on them, and maybe don't necessarily also make the necessary deselections, right? They say yes to some things, but not necessarily no to some things. So is there kind of a fake focus versus actual focus thing going on here?
Yeah, I think if you had to look at some of the two sort of symptoms of fake strategy in this context, the first one is that you don't have your strategy operating model in place, so people just start violating whatever focus or...
We want to do enterprise, they want you
selling to. And then you go like, hey, I think there's an opportunity in SMB, and being opportunistic is fine, but opportunistic without any guardrails is just a recipe for disaster, right? So if there's no consequences or no operating model in place that sort of introduces any consequences of violations, I think it's an important thing to get in place. And then I think a second one is maybe sort of fake alignment, right? Aligning around totally vague labels or ambitions.
We want to be the leader in.
We want to be the leader in, or even we want to grow in Europe, or we play in the industrial space, or whatever, where you go like, it sounds right, but when you sort of, if you're in the company and in the industry and you open up, there's so many nuances that get lost, and it's not really a proper trade-off where you have to say no to anything, right? So that type of fake alignment under the banner of vague concepts, I think, is also something that is pretty popular, and it's for good reasons, right? It's the politics of a firm, and maybe they cannot agree, so they agree to the lowest common denominator, and then that becomes the agreement, but it's not really providing any clarity. That's why I also not just said like, hey, we need a strategy. What you probably need is some sort of focus, which is, so as you always say, Brian, it's something about where do we double down and where do we actively say no. And of course that's part of a strategic process, but for this piece I call it strategic focus. So where do we really play, and where do we have a strong sort of ability to win, and then doubling down on that, and then we need to find a way to hash out whatever disagreements
and I think you need to have those disagreements, right? Because I think actually most strategies start with a very pointed edge, right? It's a sharp sword, and then over countless meetings and workshops and wordsmithery, you kind of dull the blade, right? It's like, yes, but we need to win in Europe and US. But we can't forget Asia, et cetera, just as a very simple example. So I think there is a politics angle to this, saying that generally people, I think, start with a sharp edge and then go through a process of deteriorating it. So I guess the question is more like, how do you actually address that without, of course, also getting lost in a political storm of disagreements and disagreements?
But I think that's a really good question, and I think maybe it comes back to the question of who owns growth, right? And I think that's a really interesting question, because in some companies, growth is a department, right? I think they rebranded marketing or some variation or mutation of marketing to growth, or maybe sales is called growth. Which is, I think, is for me is a bit of a misunderstanding. In my view, this is a board and C-level and really a CEO level topic. That does not mean that the CEO should drive all the initiatives or develop all the key concepts or the execution piece, but especially when it comes to strategic focus, I think board and CEO level clarity around some of these pieces, and then you can build on the opinions of people, but honestly, it's a CEO level decision, and then one way or the other, people would have to fall in line, I think, behind that.
Yeah, I think you could say, if the question is where will growth come from, if you're just looking at your sales leader and asking that question, you're probably missing 80% of the answer, right? Because you're getting to that question through a very specific lens. Let's say I'm a sales leader in an industrial company with 300 field salespeople. Where will growth come from is probably going to be something about I need to hire additional field sellers, right? Because that's the model I have today, and I own, right?
Let me look at my pipeline.
Yeah, and I need to win 2 big deals next year and accelerate smaller deals and yada yada, right? Yes. So you look through a very small keyhole to answer the question, where will growth come from? Yes. And I think that's what speaks to this being a CEO issue, right? That you have to have a broader view, right?
And sometimes, and on the other side of the coin, marketing maybe comes with a bit too academic or detached view on that as well, right? So there is different departments, brings different angles to it, but honestly, ultimately, it's a CEO question, and I think as part of this exercise, there's also room to look beyond what do we have in our pipeline, which clients that we closed last year, but really do a level setting of where growth will come from, and ask hard questions about whether we are playing in the right arenas and all these things, instead of just repeating and reiterating the existing system, right?
That makes sense. I think a lot of people intuitively get strategic focus, right? Because it's a very, I think it's something we talk about a lot. The second, let's say, piece of the puzzle that you mentioned, the commercial architecture, I think this one is really interesting because it's, I think, maybe the least well understood part of the engine here. So what you're saying is basically, hang on, most commercial models, they're not really designed per se. They just kind of accumulate over time. And I think if we stick to the analogy of architecture, it's kind of a house being built one brick at a time, one room, one floor at a time. So if that's the kind of mental image we have in our head, what does that look like in an actual company, like an industrial company? What does the house look like that's been built, accumulated over time?
And maybe there's 2 angles to it. One thing is how difficult it is for some companies to actually change this architecture once you're settled in your house, right?
Yeah.
We've had a client that the go-to-market model has been sort of since inception of this company, hundreds of years ago, almost, as sort of a pure breed industrial company, have been sort of indirect, selling through distributors. Very classical indirect model, all good. Then you start to develop solutions which are more digital, sort of software, where they have to suddenly, if not sell, then at least influence end customers directly. And that seems like it's just one more arrow on your go-to-market system, right? Yeah. But it changes the whole dynamic around how demand is created, what you're selling, how you sell, who you sell to, how marketing and sales play together, incentive models, forecasting, time horizon. Everything actually changes through that that subtle step. And then you could say, let's design the new system. But again, the old system is basically so ingrained that the change is really just a fundamental and very, very extensive change exercise that takes years and years and years. While it's very easy on paper to draw out what needs to be in place. Actually setting up the organization to do it is a very big sort of transformation, right? So that's more on the how do you change piece, and that's I think one piece to the puzzle to pay some respect to this exercise and be respectful of how big a mountain to climb it can actually be. Then you unbox what are then the typical things that sits under the sort of the commercial architecture. What are these bricks and windows and whatnot you need in a house, right? Some of the typical ones, and I don't want to be too prescriptive here, but a typical one is the go-to-market piece. How to go to market, indirect, direct, whatever sits in between, and
self-serve,
and
etc.
Right? Again, a lot of companies are thinking about it, testing it out, but it's also often driven by legacy and change and some of these things.
My favorite example there, working with banks, is that, how did banks start? They started with an advisor, right, as the core atomic unit of the go-to-market. And even though banks have evolved a lot and have a lot of self-serve platforms and, the biggest customers, biggest companies on earth and the smallest, freelance customers, everything still in most banks revolve around the advisor as the kind of core atomic unit. Then sometimes the advisor has 500 customers, sometimes he has one. Yeah. But in a way, it's still all around that core belief that we go to market through an advisor. Yes. I think it's just such a fun example of, even though things happen, it's very hard to change that core kind of how do we get there.
So the key question is just how many accounts does an advisor have, so it's just instead of resetting entirely how you go to market, right? Yeah. Engagement model is the same. Typically, accounts are placed with a field rep, and then some accounts are big, so some reps have fewer clients because in order for them to meet quota, they just need few of these big clients. Yeah. And other account managers just have a lot, sort of the long tail. But in essence, there's a possibility to totally sort of reset and revisit how you engage clients consistently to make sure your investment follow potential, for example, as well. So engagement model is it's another key design element that really can upend a lot of things, and I'm very bullish on that as well. Another one, Brian, is of course pricing and packaging. It's also interesting to see how those things has come about, right? For legacy reasons, and it used to be like that. And again, then you change maybe the delivery of the product or the cost logic of your product, or the customer needs change, or you enter new segments. All these things should of course also influence how you package and price your products. But it's not always that it follows suit, and you're leaving a lot of money right on the table for that reason. So
and maybe there's a tendency again to kind of fall into very set standards. Like right now in the technology space, of course, there's a lot of SaaS companies looking at, we have user-based pricing. Why? Because that's been the whole foundation of SaaS over the last 10, 20 years. And of course, what's happening now with AI, it means that this whole concept of user-based pricing looks a bit iffy, right? Yeah. The value breaks down for a lot of corporations because they now pay a lot in licenses. Or maybe they have an AI as the single user of a very complex system instead of 20 humans. Hang on, the whole value equation breaks down now.
The cost piece as well for the client, for the customers, when in the old world SaaS you had 90% marginal cost, now you suddenly have 70%.
You have compute, right?
And it goes up and down, right? Yeah. So that, for something like that, for example, have you thought it through, right? And then a fourth one, I think, is how do you structure your offering and portfolio, and how do you go to market with that? Are you selling solutions? Are you selling individual pieces? How do you bundle, structure them, position them, and communicate value? All these things is also a key design element. It's not about inventing new products. I think that sits outside the commercial arena. But once you bring products to market, have you carefully considered how to and that's, we've done a few of these, Brian. It's an interesting exercise. Sometimes we're asked to support on a website project. We're not a design agency or anything, but just forcing companies to think about how they present and position what they do can really trigger a lot of introspection and interesting discussions. So
and I think there's like one thing that a lot of these companies sometimes face is, hey, we want to go from products to solutions, which is one of those things that's very easy to describe on a slide. You know, it's a from to, but in reality, that's a commercial architecture question. Because, hang on, what does it mean to sell solutions? It's actually a completely different thing, right? You're maybe entering the conversation earlier. You have to design for that. Maybe you need completely different sellers actually to sell solutions, because
pricing probably also changes.
The whole thing changes. Your go-to-market probably involves, let's say, system integrators, for example, if you're in the tech space. So I think it's one of those things where we're changing a core part of the commercial architecture. Could be things like the pricing model, could be things like what we just talked about here, and it actually has a lot of second order effects, right? That are maybe overlooked a bit, right?
Yes, exactly. So there's no recipes, but that could be some of the things that should sit in that box called commercial architecture, flowing down from the strategic clarity, of course.
Yeah. Let's close the commercial architecture now. We have built a more beautiful house with vision and also rooms that are coherently put together. Now somebody's got to live in that house, and maybe that's the segue to execution capability and discipline as kind of your third bucket here, right? And in a way, of course, as a company, you're made up of individuals, right? But I think there's kind of a distinction in between, are we relying on those individuals to make magic on their own, or are we kind of designing a system that's built for them to succeed in? And is it true to say that a lot of companies have a bunch of individuals running around? is that too much?
No, I think especially in sales, yes. I think that's the case, to your point. And the sometimes the sort of flat-footed response of a sales leader is, if things aren't going too well or want to do a transformation, is let's hire some more reps or some new reps,
better
and
then
these heroes, they will figure it out, right?
Yeah.
And I think this hero mentality is can take you so far, but if you're growing, you need to really build a system where you're setting people up to become heroes, not just be heroes by coincidence or design. So building a system where people can really flourish is really key. So you don't have to rely on these heroes, because there's a lot of issues with the hero mentality.
There's also not that many heroes.
There's not that many heroes. They get extremely expensive and demanding, and they quit, and all the things, and then you're kind of back to scratch, right? So I think building a system where people can really thrive, even those that are not quote unquote heroes from the get go, they maybe become heroes in that.